Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this episode, I'll give a tour through Volume 11 of Weldon's Practical Needlework, published in 1896, and I'll show you my plans and progress for the 30 breed blanket I'm knitting from my handspun yarn. So let's get started. In December 2022, I purchased a 12-volume set of Weldon's Practical Needlework. These are facsimile copies of the first 12 years Weldon's published its popular series starting in 1886. These facsimile copies were published by Piecework magazine in the early 2000s. Each volume represents one full year of monthly issues, with each issue devoted to a particular needlecraft, like knitting, crocheting, edgings, tatting, embroidery, etc. Each week, I've been giving you a tour of one of the volumes. Piecework no longer sells these hard copy facsimile copies, but they do sell digital copies of the knitting and crocheting issues on their website. Let's go to the overhead and explore what Volume 11 has for us today. The issues in this volume were originally published in 1896. So this is the facsimile edition of Weldon's Practical Needlework, Volume 11. So each of these volumes represents a year's worth of issues. Each issue is devoted to one specific craft, and then any given craft is numbered by series. So this is the bent ironwork. It's the first series. So this is the first issue that they've ever had that has to do with bent ironwork. With crochet, we see they've got 3 different issues in this year, the 20th, 29th, and 30th. For knitting, they have the 30th, 31st, 32nd, and 33rd. Other crafts they have is macrame and beadwork. Now they've had macrame lace before. This is the first series of macrame and beadwork. This is the second series they've had of point lace. And now we've also got stocking knitters. So in the very first year of Weldon's, there were 2 issues that were devoted to stocking knitting. They often include stockings within practical knitter issues, but this one is devoted strictly to stockings. It's the 5th series. And then now we've got the first series of whatever torchon lace is. So they always give you a clue about what's contained in this particular issue, how to knit a vest, quilt, borders, socks, stockings, etc. And so here you have a gentleman's waistcoat knitted in a basket pattern. And that's something that's interesting about waistcoats in the 19th century, is that typically it's the fronts that are knit. And occasionally you'll also have the back knit, but then what you do is you take it to a tailor and they do all of the finishing work. They cut it down if it needs to be in order to be shaped to the man's body size. They put in the pocket openings, they line them, they put this edging all the way around in order to finish it off. So knitting a gentleman's waistcoat wasn't that big a deal because then you had the tailor finish it off. So we've got a child's plain stocking, a child's collarette and muff combined. Oh, that's interesting. So this goes around their neck to keep them warm, and then it's got a muff here that they could put their hands in. So it's kind of like the string on mittens that you'd run through a kid's coat when I was a kid so that they wouldn't lose them. So that's an interesting item, and it's got this very curly loopy stitch pattern. So we've got bedroom slipper, we've got a little lace edging here. So edgings were very common. Somebody was asking me or commented that they hadn't really seen many shawl patterns and they were kind of surprised. And I think it could be because there are quite a few issues that either include like edgings like this or are devoted to edgings and what they call insertions, which would be like a panel. So if you were just knitting a rectangle for a shawl, you could put an insertion in, or you could put an edging on. Otherwise, you could just knit like a plain old rectangle in garter stitch and then just add your embellishments as you needed. There are occasionally shawl patterns, but there aren't a lot in these Weldon's. So we've got a little Mosley jacket for a kiddo. a petticoat and bodice. So we've got some kids' boots and a bed sock. And then we've got a yachting jersey. Sweaters in this era or jerseys were typically athletic wear or practical wear. So you might see a cardigan that somebody might wear around at home. But oftentimes these kinds of things were meant for outdoor athletic activities. So we've got a square for a quilt. And they've got this Zoov sleeveless jacket. So this was a type of shape of bodice that was popular at different points in the 19th century. I think mid-19th century they were very popular, and then toward the end of the 19th century these kind of vests that have this shaping to them became popular. And you look at these giant sleeves. This is when that era of the big Lego mutton sleeves became very popular. This is a detail of the stitch pattern that is going around the edge right here. Gentleman's hose in Highland check, a baby's petticoat, a stocking for a child of 2 or 3 years old. And that's it for, and then they have a fisherman's Ulan cap that is not illustrated. It entirely covers the back of the head and also forms a muffler for the neck. It is an excellent thing for seamen in bad weather and in night watches, and is appreciated by soldiers, cab drivers, and others. Now we've got designs for pincushion, cuffs, dolls, purses, bags, curtain band, etc. So we've got a round pincushion and lace edging. Bag for bathing dress, and bag in which to carry a bathing dress, towels, and odds and ends to and from the beach or the swimming bath. Saves a great deal of trouble to the bather. So you've got a pattern for a comforter or a cloud, and so when they are saying comforter, they're meaning a scarf. So this is an interesting little doodad. It is meant to like cover a bandage. So if you have a bandage on your finger, then you can protect it by having this knitted thing. And then this strap right here is meant to come, you know, down, and then you wrap this maybe either around the hand here or around the wrist. And so that kind of anchors that on so it doesn't slide off. I thought that was kind of an interesting little doodad. So this they're calling a shopping or work bag. So it looks a lot like a Pence bag. This is a strong and elastic receptacle for work materials or small parcels. As a fastening, procure a brass curtain ring measuring 2 inches across. Draw out or break off the tiny ring which is set in the curtain ring and slip the latter over the top of the bag. For the handle, use pink thread and 4 needles. Okay, that's what this is. So this just kind of keeps this shut, I guess. You just thread that ring through the top, and then this part expands underneath, and you carry it with this. So interesting. So we've got, it's kind of like macrame, but it's a knitted support for a vase. And this is a extinguisher pen wiper. So I guess they put stuff inside, and then you're wiping your fountain pen off inside of there. So this right here is, they're calling it a bath strap or pulley, and it's got several uses. One is that you can fold this over and hang it on the wall and then use this as like a pillow for your head when you're in the bathtub. Another thing is it says if you want to use it as a lubricant. So I think if like you're wanting to put lotion on your back or something, that you can use this, you know, you're back and forth to get that on your back. And then another thing is that it can be used as a pulley. So if you need help getting out of the bathtub, then you pull on this to help you out of bed. That's interesting, because it just seems like with something knitted is just going to stretch and you'll never get out of the tub. It's an interesting idea. Now we've got a little soap bag, long purse and open work and twist pattern. So again, we've got the rings around here to kind of close things up. I can never know how to pronounce this. Reticule, I think, or knitting bag. A tobacco pouch with a knitted cover, and a curtain band in 3 colors. A beaded cuff, a knitted silk cuff, harlequin string case. They've got a lot of just like doodads in this particular issue. Dice pattern pence purse, sequin trimming. And then they've got some punchinello caps for knitting needles. These little caps or shields are useful for protecting the points of knitting needles when work is to be carried about or packed. And then you are supposed to put corks inside them, so you poke needles into the cork. So this is an acorn emery cushion. So I guess pin cushions often have like emery powder or something in there to kind of sharpen things. So the idea is that there's a little woven cloth pouch inside of there that has the emery dust or sand or whatever it is. Then you create this acorn around it, and then you can poke your pins in there and they'll sharpen them up. So now we've got some doll clothes. More doll clothes, and then an infant's boot. This issue, how to knit purses, sponge basket, covers, rattle, cozies, belt, etc. So not a whole lot of actual clothing in this particular year of Weldon's Practical Needlework. A lead cushion or doorstop. So I guess the handle is to help you pick it up and move it. You've got a rattle covered with loop knitting, a knitted bath sponge, sock and shoe purse, a knitted flap for the back of a corset. Many ladies who leave their corsets loosely laced down the back sew a flannel flap underneath the lacing to cover the space between the two back busks. The flannel has one disadvantage: it becomes crumpled with wear, especially if the stay laces are tightened from time to time. To obviate this discomfort, a band of ribbed knitting stretched right across the lacings and sewn down both its edges to the soft part of the corset beyond the bone has many advantages. It cannot curl up, preserves the wearer from cold, and is so elastic as to set well if the lacings are loosened or tightened. So yeah, people weren't always tight lacing back then. Some people did, but a lot of people just wanted to be comfortable and have their back supported. We've got a cover for a cologne bottle, a beaded pen wiper. What is this? This is a toilet tidy. I guess you just put all your toiletries in there. I think that's what they mean by toilet. Knitted sequin belt. Letter. Oh, here's the the bassinet rug is this little loopy knitted stitches that say baby. And here's the working size of the letters. A carrot pin cushion. They did love their pin cushions. A knitted tea cozy right here. There was a tea cozy in a previous issue of Weldon's, and it was called a bachelor tea cozy, and I wasn't sure why. And then Barbara, who's the archivist at the Knitting and Crochet Guild in the UK, explained that a regular cozy has to be pulled off in order to access the teapot, but a bachelor one had holes for the spout and stuff so that you didn't have to take the cozy off in order to pour the tea. Knitted sponge net, again, things that are kind of like macrame, only in knitting. Knitted cover for a medicine bottle. They just wanted to cover up every bottle that they had. And a basket pin cushion, a knitted foot warmer, a knitted purse with expanding top, and a purse with a steel top, a purse with a bar and a ring top. Oh, now we've got one more practical knitter. Designs for jersey, mittens, gaiters, hood, dog's coat, etc. So we've got a child's gaiter. So those go over the legs and then the shoe is underneath. A stocking top. So that got very popular here. You'd have these plain stockings, but then you'd have the fold over tops that were fancy. So like if you were golfing and so you're wearing knickerbockers or cycling or something like that so that people could see the tops of your stockings. So this is just a stitch pattern. Infant's knitted shirt. We've got another stitch pattern, a lady's mitten, a gaiter, another gaiter for a young child, drawers for a child, petticoat, a child's undervest, apple leaf pattern, the Hilda bonnet. That must be for a little kid. The Carrie pattern, square for a quilt, old-fashioned shell and feather and fan, child's pretty dress, jersey for a girl of 6. And so like the adult versions for women at the time, they have these buttons that go along the shoulder and then up the neck so that you can pull it over their hairdo. And then it's got kind of the puffier sleeves that were in style for older ladies, but just not quite as dramatic. And then you've got a coat or a blanket for a dog. So this volume also has an issue of Practical Stocking Knitter. So they've got a club stocking with a Union Jack on the stocking turnover. And here's the enlarged design for that. And so these got quite a few stocking tops in this particular issue. So there's a stocking, and then you can see that stocking top, and then loads of stocking tops. That's kind of interesting with the cable going sideways. The textured ones I'm finding interesting. Some of these cycling stocking, frisbee turnover, and wide ribbed leg. That's kind of cool. And that's it. Weldon's published these monthly issues well into the early decades of the 20th century, but only the first 12 volumes were republished as facsimile copies. If you enjoyed this series and would like to see more vintage or antique books from my collection, please let me know down in the comments below. If there are any particular eras that you would like to see, or if you are curious about specific categories of garments or accessories or even techniques, please let me know. There are lots of things that could be explored, but I'd love to know what sorts of things that you might be interested in seeing. One of my goals for Finish It February this year was to come up with a plan for turning the yarns I had spun from a sampler pack of 30 wool breeds into some sort of knitted reference that I could use to remind myself of what a particular breed's wool was like. I wanted this knitted thing to be useful as a lap blanket when my office gets cold in the winter, as well as a reference guide that could inform me of wools that I might want to spin again. In the past few weeks, I finalized my plan and began working on it. And just as I learned quite a bit from spinning breed after breed in short succession, I'm learning quite a bit from knitting breed after breed as well. So let's go to the overhead and I can show you how my plan is unfolding. So I want to show you the squares that I've knit so far and some of the characteristics of those yarns. So if you look at the original photograph of that I took of all 30 breeds on the floor of my office, I have them grouped into kind of 3 sets. There is one set that is the colored wools that you see at the top. Along the bottom, you'll see like this range of natural wools, and I don't know how well you can tell on the photograph, but over on the right edge, it's the whitest of the natural colors, and then over to the left is the one that is sort of the most yellow. Then there are these 5 wools that I have green arrows pointing at, and those yarns were spun from long wools. Like Lincoln and Teeswater, Wensleydale, things like that. They just visually look very different. So we've got the wools that are colored. Those have a visual difference. There's this mild spectrum of natural wools, but then there are these 5 yarns that are very different. So when I was trying to figure out how am I going to knit these up, how am I going to plan out, like I'm going to have 30 squares of some sort. So 5 squares by 6 squares. How am I going to lay this out to make it, interesting to look at, or interesting for me to look at or refer to? How am I going to lay out the dark wools and intersperse them? And so I came up with a plan. These on the bottom row are all of those long wools, those 5 skeins that just look very different. I have 4 brown wools that I'm going to put in a square here. 3 of them are very dark brown, and then one of them is kind of a lighter brown. This is the Manxlachten. So those will be in the center there. And then I have, I think, 5 grays that I would definitely call gray. That's these yarns right here. This one I've already knit up. This is the Icelandic, but I've got these 5 grays. And then I've got these two, which are this was obviously a colored wool. This one, this is a Shetland wool, and it seems like it should go with the other naturals, but it's just a different shade compared to the others. Like the others have more, this is the yellowest of them, and then it goes all the way up to one that's quite nearly white. And this just didn't quite fit into it. It's got this very slightly, very, very light sort of tan to it, and not like this kind of yellowish, creamy color. So I decided to keep these two. You know, this is obviously a color, but I decided to keep this one, or just decide that this was a colored wool. So that Shetland is up here, and then this is the Suffolk, and that one will go down here. And then what I have going on is this one that's the most yellow right here. That's the eider. And so I'm going to go up from there, and it's getting lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter and lighter. So my hope is that this is different enough from the two very lightest ones that it will stand out a little bit. So I just wanted some kind of a plan. It helps me to have some kind of a structure that I can feel free to break whatever my rules are. But if I have just the entire universe of choices, I just don't know what to do. And so I need to give myself some kind of plan. And then once I'm into it and I see what's actually happening with the yarns, then I can make some decisions about how I'm going to deviate from that. So one of the challenges of this, coming up with this, blanket, like how was I going to knit it? Because I had thought about doing things in different stitch patterns, but these yarns are not all the same yarn weight. Anytime you're mixing yarns in a project, you might be mixing yarns that are really the same yarn but just different colors. You might be mixing things that are different stitch patterns, and so the gauges might be different of whatever's going on inside the borders that you have going around. So you'd need different stitch counts for that. But if it's the same yarn, you're still going to be using the same needle size, but you might need to adjust stitch counts. So as an example of what I'm talking about, I did a blanket a number of years ago that was made from a booklet of washcloth, baby washcloth patterns. So some of the squares were garter stitch around the edges and stockinette in the middle, and then some of them had the washcloth patterns of little garter stitch figures, like a duck or an umbrella or a flamingo or something like that. That little garter stitch pattern didn't really affect the overall size of the square. So regardless of whether it was going to be a stockinette square with garter stitch edges or have a little garter stitch design in it, I was going to need the same number of stitches and the same number of rows. And of course I was using the same needle size. So what I could do was just knit those in strips. When I got done with a white square, I could just switch to the yellow yarn and then make that square. It was just attached. And then I only had to do a few seams, the long seams between each of those strips. Well, then you get into a situation like this blanket here, where I'm using different colors. It's the same yarn. I'm using the same needle size, but I'm using different stitch patterns inside the garter stitch borders. And so this is a situation, this is not my design, this is a Janet Szabo design. Each of these squares were meant to be the same size, and so cast on the same number of stitches for the garter stitch border, and the same number of rows were worked for the entire square, but the number of stitches changed once you started working the stitch pattern, because the gauge of this stitch pattern can vary based on what kind of what the stitch pattern is. So this was something where she really had to think about and experiment with figure out what the gauge was, how can I fit these, how many repeats can I get in here, and do this kind of thing with every one of these stitch patterns so that they all fit nice and symmetrically, and what stitch count is going to allow her to do that for all of these. So that's a situation where, again, I didn't have to worry about the starting stitch count or the needle size, and she had done all the gauge calculations for making that switch from the garter stitch border to whatever the stitch pattern was. So my situation is I'm using different yarns. These are often spun in a very similar way, but they have slightly different yarn weights. And because they're different breeds, they have different characteristics, even if I spun them very similarly. So they have different yarn weights, which means they're going to work up to a different gauge, and which means I'll need a different needle size, which means even the cast on can vary in the number of stitches. Because of that complexity, I decided to keep the squares as simple as possible and just have it be stockinette. And one thing that I have learned about gauge differences between garter stitch and stockinette is there's usually like a 10%, somewhere close to a 10% for me anyway, gauge difference between the garter and the stockinette. So if I cast on 20 stitches in garter stitch, I'll add a couple of additional stitches in the first row stockinette, and then I'll decrease them out at the top. If I start out with 30 stitches, I'll do 3. So if I have somewhere in between, I'll just choose 20, I'll choose 2 or 3. One stitch isn't going to make a huge difference, but 2 or 3 is going to make a difference. If I don't add extra stitches, this will end up wider, and that's going to cause even more of a curvature here, which is going to really encourage the garter stitch to want to compress. So garter stitch wants to compress the same way that ribbing wants to compress in this way, but there's just as much fabric and it's just as easy for you can block it out in the length. But if this is too wide, that's going to encourage this to shrink down. It's just going to be a little bit harder. So I find it easier to control the width of the top and the bottom by changing the stitch counts, and then the edges will block out just fine. So the way I have to approach it, I talked a little bit about this last week, is I have to figure out what yarn weight this is. I don't have a package telling me anything about this. This is yarn I made myself. So I have to wrap it basically around a ruler. I was showing this last week, where you wrap it around a ruler and you count how many wraps per inch you have, and that indicates the yarn weight, and that then gives me a clue about what gauge I'm likely to get with that yarn. There were some things that were a little unexpected with the long wools. They didn't quite behave as I expected in terms of gauge, and I thought, well, maybe I'm calculating the wraps per inch incorrectly. But as I finished the long wools and then moved on to wools that had more elasticity in them, I saw that the behavior difference might just have to do with the breed and the behavior of wool from these particular breeds. So this is something that is really great about a breed study. Like with spinning, and I was spinning 1 or 2 different breeds per week, and I could more quickly compare the experience of spinning one breed with another and kind of get the idea of how to work with that, or how to adjust with a different yarn that has a different staple length and just behaves differently, as might be harder to control or might be really easy to control as I was spinning. And I'm seeing the same sort of thing with knitting with one after another, and comparing and being able to kind of predict what the behavior is going to be. So that has been really helpful to go through this kind of an experience. So the next step of this is my plan, because I have these tags that were attached to the skein, and now I have to I can't attach this tag to this square when it's being washed and blocked, because I actually wanted to soak them to see what would happen to the yarns when they were actually soaked and not just steamed. And they did change when they were washed versus when they were steamed. But I also want to keep track of the leftovers as well. My goal is to do like 5 per week and keep track of them in their little piles like this, and then I can sew them together in the correct order, and then I'll know what I have for that, and then I can reattach the tags to the mini skeins, so I can still have this to compare to in the future as well. And then eventually what I need to do is create a label for each of these squares to put on the back. So this is a question for you guys. For those of you who are quilters and you use fabric to make your labels, I'm curious if you use a specific type of fabric for those labels, because I'm going to use my sewing machine to embroider the words on the back of them and then hand sew them on the back of each of these squares. But if you have a recommendation, if there's a specific fabric that you find is best for that sort of label where you're machine embroidering the words on them, I'd love to know down in the comments. So let's go through these wools. This is Lincoln. And this, the thing about these long wools is because they don't have a lot of crimp, they have sheen to them. And this is not a yarn that I particularly enjoyed working with. When it doesn't have elasticity, it's kind of like it's not as bad, but it's kind of like working with cotton or linen where it just doesn't have any give to it. And this used up most of the yarn. This one had the shortest number of yards, and I think it's because it's most compressed. And so I wanted to figure out what size the maximum size I could make with this yarn, and then just base all the other ones off this. There's no elasticity, like when I pull on this, there's no give to it. So this is kind of heavy and dense feeling. It's smooth, it's not like scratchy, like I wouldn't want to wear this next to my skin necessarily, but it's not like harsh. It's not really like twine. But it has that sense of twine or string where it doesn't have any give. This is the kind of thing that I think we were talking in our knitting group last night, that this is probably something that'd be great for like working for a warp. If you were a weaver, like this would be perfect for something like that. It's just not something I really want to knit with. So that's the Lincoln. Then the next one I knit, this one had the next smallest amount of yardage. This one was Devon. And this one is kind of a hairier yarn. Let's see if I can get in so you can see. Can you see kind of how hairy it is? And they tell you with these long wools you can put less twist in them because the staple length is so long and the yarn will just hold together. It still has some give to it when I push on it, but it doesn't really have any elasticity when I pull on it. It doesn't have any of that. And, it didn't knit up particularly evenly. And who knows, that's probably also a bit of my spinning ability. But yeah, again, not something that I would want to knit with, but it's probably good for like weaving, good rug yarn, for example. The next one was Teeswater, and this one actually looks much better in the fabric, and it was silkier to the touch, but still that very long fiber that created a kind of a limp skein, finer gauge. So I was knitting with different needle sizes because the Lincoln was probably the thickest one, and so I used a larger needle with that. And as I'm started working with the Teeswater, I was going down in needle sizes. I think I might have been using a size 5, US 5, which is 3.75 millimeter, where I was using a US 7, which was 4.5 millimeter for the Lincoln. So this feels nice. There is a little give. You can see my fingers are kind of moving apart from each other. So there's a little give to this one, unlike those first two. So I think that's probably also why it behaved nicer in the fabric. It looks more like a nicer fabric. So I could see potentially knitting something like this that I wanted to have a lot of drape. So this is actually, not so bad at all. It's pretty smooth, and it has that sheen that these long wools all seem to have. This one is Masham, M-A-S-H-A-M, and let's see what kind of give this one has. A tiny bit, probably not as much as the Teeswater. A little bit, and again, it knit up nicer than those first two, but again, a lot of drape, and maybe it's going to be something that's probably going to be really durable because of the length of the staple, and so maybe this would be good for like a jacket, some outerwear kind of thing, but not certainly probably not something you'd wear next to your skin. All of these have just a lot of drape. And then the final one was the finest one that I spun. It just naturally spun finer. You know, I'd start out with sort of a default method of spinning, and just some things just spun finer. So this one, you know, a little bit of give, not very much at all. And again, a silkier feel to it. So maybe even something like a shawl, you know, something that you'd want to have a lot of drape to could work well with this. But, you know, these yarns just, they aren't blooming. They're not going to fill in the spaces in between. If any of you who have worked with long wools in knitting, like on their own, not as a blend, I'd love to hear what sorts of things you might have knit them with, because this is probably the nicest feeling of all of them. The other thing you can see is like how much yarn I have left of the Wensleydale that was spun finer than I have of the Lincoln. So I started out with 1 ounce of all of them in terms of fiber. So this is thicker and it's just a denser yarn. And the Wensleydale, I had, you know, quite a bit left afterwards, and not that much of the Lincoln. One of the things that the knitting process is teaching me in terms of this breed study is, because I have so much more experience with knitting and I kind of have certain expectations about how yarn is going to behave in certain situations. And so when I'm being surprised, I can think about, you know, is that because it's the breed? Is it because it's the way I spun it? You know, what is causing this unexpected difference? Because the way yarn is constructed can really affect how it's going to knit up. So this is just helping me really understand, first of all, how I might want to approach sampling when I'm when I'm going to sit down in the future to spin something. Like, I have more ideas about how I will document and execute the sampling process. That's always been something I haven't really understood how to do. And now I have a better idea of, oh, here's what I'm going to look for. I'm going to look for how this actually knits up. And here, you know, I'm going to see how this spinning process affects the knitting process, and how, you know, doing it this other way, how that affects the knitting process as well as the finished fabric. So I just have a better idea of what I want to plan for and experiment with going forward. So, you know, my notes for this during the spinning part of the breed study were not great. I had a worksheet that I was filling out at the start, and then I started taking fewer notes or things that I thought were more important. I don't think my notes could have been any better if they were more, if I just filled out more information, because I don't know that I'd be able to look at that and say, oh yeah, I understand what I did from reading these notes. I don't. So I really do think it's going through the knitting process that I understand really well that's causing me to say, oh, here's what I want to test for in the future when I try a different breed and I want to do sampling. So that has really helped me figure out how I want to approach spinning, rather than what I usually do, which is just sit down and like see what happens, which only gets you so far. And I was kind of stuck in this plateau of spinning experience and ability. And I think I might be able to advance myself a little bit more now that I'm having this knitting experience with my hand spun yarn. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.